Great. So, this is the second and final panel of the day on music and mental health. We've got another fine panel here who I'll ask to introduce themselves. So, let's start with Keiza.
Hi, I'm Keiza and I work in the health and welfare team at the Help Musicians UK charity.
Who've just recently done a fantastic report.
I'm Jasmine. I have an artist management company called Tremor Music Management, and I'm currently writing a book on music and mental health.
Hello, I'm Fiona. I work for the Music Managers Forum. If you don't know who we are, we basically represent about 500 artist managers here in the UK, just over 3,000 in the US. And we work with them to support them. We do a lot of education and training, and we do a lot of lobbying and advocacy on their behalf as well.
Right, okay. So just as a little bit of background, as an introduction, I imagine that we're all aware of recent health situations faced by Kanye West, Sinead O'Connor, and even more tragically, Lil Peep last year. These instances of mental health issues seem to be increasing. Maybe increasing because we've got 24-hour media, so we're hearing about more stuff. But it's interesting to see that in your report, Can Music Make You Sick? 71% of music industry people that responded said that they had experienced anxiety and panic attacks, and 65% said they suffered from depression. So these are staggering figures, frightening figures, really. But thankfully, three guests today are doing sterling work to support musicians and try and hopefully avoid problems happening in the future. And I also know of quite a few ex-industry people that are becoming mental health practitioners and helping out. So they're coming from a point of knowledge. So it's long been discussed that there's a connection between creativity and mental health issues, and Aristotle wrote about it 2,000 years ago. How do you feel about that kind of equation between creativity and mental health?
Okay. I think that very, very highly creative people tend to have a slightly different psychological makeup than maybe someone who's very scientifically minded or extremely business minded. And that can often result in them being much more exposed to what's going on mentally around them, and also being quite a lot more affected by it. There's a really interesting book written by a guy in Australia called Living with a Creative Mind, and he's got a really interesting way of looking at. I recommend it if you ever are working with musicians, or even if you are a musician. What can help the most, I think, if you feel like you're having problems, is just understanding how your mind works. And it's not a bad thing, it's not a weakness, it's not something to be ashamed of. It's just everyone's mind works in a slightly different way. Having said that, I do think that everybody, it doesn't matter who you are, is at risk of mental illness. I think it doesn't pick on a certain type of person. I think it can affect absolutely anybody, and it can absolutely take you by surprise. You can be a very strong-minded individual, and then find one day that you might be having some issues. So yeah, I think that kind of sits in the middle of it.
Cool.
I think I agree with that, sort of, to a certain extent. I do agree, and I've found it in so many different creative minds. You get people that are all over the place, just generally. My other half is a perfect example of, he is a film producer, and he is in so many different places all at the same time. Luckily, he hasn't had any issues, but I think there are certain things that can factor into when you're working in music. I think there are things that can factor in that will trigger certain mental illnesses. For example, bipolar.
Yeah.
Drugs don't cause bipolar unless it's already there, but they can trigger it. And I think that sort of supports exactly what you're saying. But that's, yeah, I'm sort of on the fence about it.
I think it's also true you say that it's what might draw somebody to be a creative, if you like, but also what happens to them once they're in that industry. And I think it might be that you might go into an industry and actually you've got good well-being, because the research does show that people who do make music have a higher level of sort of satisfaction, if you like, than people who don't. But it's what happens to you once you're in the industry that might cause you to become unwell as well. So I think it's
doing the industry. Do you want to elaborate on the kind of work situations that cause people trouble?
Well, there's lots of things, and I think that's the thing. It's lots of different things. It's the precariousness of it. So the fact that you don't necessarily know how much money you're going to earn from one month to another, and people have talked about the fact that even if they are earning well, there's a feeling that at any moment this could stop. So it's the insecurity of it. It's the fact that it can have an effect on relationships in all sorts of different ways. It might be because you're away touring for a long time, but also one of the things that we've been looking at recently is the whole issue of parenting, becoming parents. How do you become a parent if you're someone who's going to need to be away on tour, and can you even afford it? Because if you can't work for a certain amount of time, how's that going to impact? And it's the fact that your self-worth is so tied up with what you do, and what that means if something that you produce gets negative feedback or doesn't get picked up. So I think it's lots of different things rather than one thing specifically. I think it's a combination of things.
Yeah, I agree with I completely agree with that. I mean, yeah, as you say, there's certain things that are much harder than others, and there's certain situations that you get in that are much harder than others. Like when you were saying before, when we were talking about touring, and how sometimes you're on a massive high, and then suddenly you're back home and you're on your own, and you're at a massive low. So you can be performing to thousands of people on a main stage, and then go to cooking, or going to the supermarket, as you said, and it's just normal going from being a superstar to being completely normal, and that can have a massive detrimental effect on what you're doing. And as you say about financial pressures as well. Financial pressures in the music industry are possibly the biggest, I would say, one of the biggest impacts on mental health, in my opinion.
Particularly for artists. I think if you're working at a label, or you're working at a management company, or you're working for a live promoting company or something like that, or you're working in radio, your situation is much more secure. But if you're an artist, you don't really know from one minute to the next.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of artists are self-employed, so and that's sort of, you have to create the work in order to earn your money, and in order to do that, it requires a lot more work than, as you say, working in a much more secure job.
But also, I guess there's a precariousness in terms of, you might be struggling along for 6 months or a year, and all of a sudden your record's all over social media and the radio, and suddenly you're a big star, and you're feeling like you're a big star, but the royalties haven't yet come through. You're being treated like a big star. You still got no money, and you can't understand it. You're resentful towards the record label, or perhaps the manager, and that causes an imbalance. And then finally the money does come through, and you've gone from having nothing to millions, and you're just like, completely disoriented.
Yeah.
You must have come across people like that.
I think we don't do very well as an industry in terms of actually preparing artists for what might be on their way.
Yeah.
you get the kind of standard PR and media training, for example, but no one's there preparing the artist for what happens if there is really negative press that comes out of an interview that they've done, because that can have a hugely damaging effect on their psyche and can put them off doing interviews for life. I think it's really, that's where the manager and the label comes in. I was having a chat with a friend who works for a charity called Music Support. They're a very interesting charity. If you ever have a chance to check them out, I definitely would. They've got a 24-hour helpline that they launched last year. It's a group of industry executives. They've all been in labels, they've all been managers, artists, tour managers. They get how the industry works. I think 9 out of 10 of them are in recovery. They're all addicts. And I was having a chat with him, and he made a really good point about the fact that as an industry, we work under business ethics, but there's a huge difference between business ethics and medical ethics. Because if you're a doctor, you're dealing with life and death situations, so kind of law around what your job entails is very different. And I think probably as an industry we should be moving towards a more medical, ethical way of functioning.
Yeah.
Sounds like a good plan.
I just think that having met with some of, I don't know whether you've met with some of the people, say at William Morris, for example, the higher people, they're brutal. You know, I was saying before, they are absolutely brutal, and that can have such a detrimental effect on what you're doing. Is that you might feel secure in your job, but we were saying that you could be there one day and gone the next, and that unsecure nature of being at work and working in that sort of environment is really, really affecting people just in general. And they are very, very business minded, so the way that they do things is if you don't do a good job, that's just how it is. And really, they're not really thinking about anybody's mental health in that situation. So, yeah, I think as a...
People don't understand it.
Yeah.
I think it is really hard. You haven't had any mental health issues. It's like trying to imagine what it would be like with a tail. You just can't understand it. You can't physically put yourself in someone else's shoes, which is why I think the most important thing that's going on at the moment, you mentioned a few artists earlier, where some really awful things have happened. So the most important thing at the moment is awareness and listening and understanding what's going on, even if you can't put yourself in someone else's shoes, and encouraging people who have experienced mental health issues or are having them to talk, because that is part of the healing process. The more you talk about it, the more sort of stable you'll feel.
I was saying the more you realise you're not alone, because you probably find your experience is shared by lots of other people.
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay. So potentially one of the problems is that there seems to be a whole kind of romance about the tortured genius. You know, so people will look at Kurt Cobain, say, or Amy Winehouse, or Sid Barrett, and go, "Isn't that wonderful?" You know, and they romanticise the situation, the painful situation that these artists are going through. And I think that you know, the media certainly play on this idea of the tortured genius, and musicians and fans also celebrate this idea, you know, and you know, and I think it almost encourages new artists to live those kind of lives, live those lives right on the edge. You know, the tortured genius is kind of an alluring idea, but it's ultimately destructive, you know. But yeah, just was raising it as a discussion point, what you felt about it, you know, because I think so many people buy into that idea. You know, I've worked with enough, you know, I know that people do buy into that sort of crazy idea.
Honestly, I think artists are a lot smarter than that. I don't think anyone looks at, well, haven't met many artists who've looked at that situation and thought that'd be nice to jump off a bridge. Get to
No,
that
but
point.
what I mean is that they read all the stories about Jim Morrison or Jimi Hendrix or Sid Vicious or whatever and think, I want to be like them, so I've got to have the drug addiction that they had, and I've got to behave like them, and I've got to put myself in these situations because it is going to make me like them. I'm going to be inspired by it. But I know this exists because I work in public bands that have that mentality. Do you see what I mean?
It's the sex, drugs and rock and roll thing, isn't
It
it?
is
But
that- it is
it's
that
like,
myth, yeah.
it's like, it's cool,
Yeah.
you know, and certainly some of the people that took part in this were saying, you know, it's about, you feel like you've got to be at the parties, you've got to take the drugs, you've got to drink, because if you don't, you're not cool or you're not committed to it somehow. And I think so, I don't know whether it's necessarily that people aspire to it, but I think certainly people that I've spoken to have felt like they have to play that part. It obviously depends what type of music you do, I guess, to some extent, but that if you don't play the part, then you're not really cool, you're not really a musician, you know, because that's part of the deal. And I certainly know people who've got drawn into that for that reason, kind of felt like if I can't say no to the drugs because I'm a musician, that's kind of what I'm supposed to do, and everyone else is, so I can't be the one that isn't, you know.
And I think the other danger around it is when a musician is convinced that the drugs they're taking is connected to their output and creativity and productivity. That's a really difficult scenario for the team around them, and for the artists themselves. If it's having a negative effect on their career and themselves and the people around them, how do you convince somebody that they shouldn't be doing what they think is right for their career? That's a really difficult conversation to have. We're talking about artists being in denial before.
Yeah.
I've been dealing with a manager whose artist is the most important artist on his roster, and we were talking about financial security before as well. That can impact these conversations. And this artist smokes a lot of weed, and I think danger with weed is people see it as quite a harmless drug, and then it can't have that much of an impact. But actually, it can.
In large quantities, for sure, yeah.
It's become way more powerful now.
Yeah.
It's not what it was in the 60s or something. It's it probably lays people out.
I met a lot of people at university who used to smoke a lot because they think that helps the creativity and that brings the best music out of them. And I don't know whether anybody that actually has had the same sort of outcome from it, or as you were saying, that they when they smoke a lot, they just get to the point where they can't come off it. It does become an addiction as to wake up in the morning and start doing that in order to make your music every single day, and that shouldn't be how it is. And the financial amount of money, I mean, I work with an artist who is pretty much in the same situation, smokes a lot of weed, but probably spends a good £250 to £300 on it per week. And that's just extortionate if you think about the level of money that you're spending on a habit, effectively. But continue.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think his issue is that, you know, if this artist isn't performing and isn't doing what it is that they love, he's also going to lose his income, because if the artist stops, his job stops. So when a manager's in that position, it would be absolutely wrong for them to keep that artist in that position for their own financial gain. I think that is what's happened a lot in the past. I think artists have been pushed to continue doing what they do at whatever cost, to make money for everyone around them. And that's a situation that has to stop.
Over the years, I guess there's been comments made about certain managers and certain record labels quite liking the fact that their artists are addicted. Often to heroin seems to be the one that they seem to like, because they can kind of control them a little bit more, and it's one of the worst sides of the industry, that some executives like to keep their stars medicated because it means that they can, kind of make more of a move on them or control them in some kind of way. Whether this is done deliberately, whether this is just a rumor, I couldn't possibly say, but it's one of those stories that you hear quite a lot. So in your Can Music Make You Sick reports, you were finding that maybe up to 3 times, musicians are maybe up to 3 times more likely to suffer from mental illness compared to the general public, which again is a staggering statistic. In what ways one is, why is it like this? And in what ways do mental health issues in the music industries differ from those in other sectors? Because people can have mental health issues just working in your office or, on a building site.
I think it's like we were saying before, I think it's a combination of things that are unique to the music industry, or in some cases performing arts more broadly.
Yeah.
Which is the fact that, you feel, because so many people that I've spoken to talk about self-doubt, that they're never sure whether what they've done is good enough. And sometimes that's the pressure that they put on themselves. But it means that they feel like that it's like a constant feeling of having to try harder, having to do more, and exhausting themselves, because the other thing that comes up a lot is people feeling that they can't take any time off. They've got to be on it all the time. Because if they're not writing, if they're not producing, if they're not putting stuff out there, if they're not gigging, if they're whatever, obviously there's a financial aspect to that. But it's kind of feel like if I've got to do this in order to kind of make myself feel that this is what I'm doing. So I think it's a combination of the difficulty with the precarity around finances, around relationships, around this sort of feelings of self-worth and self-doubt, and also the way that other people see them, because people often say things like, it's not a proper job, music's not, it's not a proper, why don't you get a proper job? And if you're in that situation, how can you explain to somebody else, that it's such a, it's demoralising and it's demeaning and it shows a lack of understanding. And then there's the criticism, obviously with social media in particular these days, the fact that there's this constant sort of feedback loop, if you like. And I think it's also when people do start to feel that they are struggling, often with anxiety and things like that, is where do they take that? And often that results in alcohol and drugs as a coping mechanism. But the other thing that people talked about is feeling like if they were to admit to their weaknesses, then they see their peers as their competitors. Yeah. So if they were to say, oh, I'm struggling with this, then is somebody else going to exploit that in some way, or are they going to jump in? Yeah, are they going to jump in? Or, and I'm feeling like there's where people don't understand. They want to speak to other musicians, but feel that they can't do that necessarily because of this sort of competitiveness and not wanting to talk about weaknesses. So I think in a way that there's a whole set of things that come together that can start to make somebody feel like that. And then there's not very much, that there's not necessarily a place where people can go with that once they do start to feel like that. At least they feel that that there's not the support out there. And one of the things that came through from the research and was the reason why the Music Minds Matter service was set up was because people were saying, that they weren't getting support. If they were going to their GP, there are long waits for therapists usually on the NHS. That's if you can get your GP to refer you in the first place. More often than not, you might be given medication. And so there's not necessarily support there once people do start to feel like they're struggling. I think that's my take on it.
I mean, surely that's also there's an onus on the managers, the key people at the record labels. You know, probably the A&R person is likely to be the person closest to the staff. You know, those people have a responsibility to keep a check on the mental health of their charges, really. You know, I mean, they may not be trained in that field, but, you know, but you can tell when someone's not themselves, and you need to talk to the artist about it, and you need to talk to your colleagues about it and say, look, you know, what do we, you know, how do we approach it? I was out with so-and-so the other night, and they did something that was really bizarre. They started talking in a really bizarre way. There's something not right. They're not themselves. What do we do about it? We find, you know, we find a doctor, we find a psychiatrist, we you know, we talk to their family, we try and find what the root of the problem is. Surely that is the responsibility of everyone that works closely with an artist.
I think that's a really good point.
Yeah.
We produced the Music Manager's Guide to Mental Health last year, and that came out of the fact we started getting loads of calls from managers who were saying that they thought their artists might have a problem, but didn't even know whether or not it was their responsibility to do anything about it. Thought that it was, well, they thought it was a very personal thing, probably maybe their friends or family would be better placed. But actually, as their manager, their health and well-being is just as much of a responsibility for you as is their commercial business.
You know, because as a manager, or even as an A&R person or a PR person, when you're working with these artists, you know, many of them the same age as you guys and girls here, you know, young people that are thrust into a world of fame, success, money and drugs, or a world of failure and frustration, you know, that they've probably not been prepared for. You know, as that manager or A&R person, you are like surrogate parents or surrogate big brothers or big sisters, and you have to look out for these people. They're human beings, you know, and that it sort of worries me that a lot of the industry just treat the artists like a product, piece of meat, you know, and it's. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. I think it's also though that it is what you said about knowing what to look out for, because sometimes, you know, people can be quite good at hiding what's going on for them. So it might not necessarily be obvious that somebody's struggling, and I think, you know, it would be helpful for people to have some training about what things you might look out for and the places that you can go. But also because they might be having their own difficulties, because like you say, it's not just the musicians, it's people around them as well who can experience a lot of these things, and you know, they might need some support themselves, you know, so as well.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I mean, there are different parts of the music industry as well that have very different practices. So, I mean, I work with electronic music artists, so I don't deal with anybody really that's in live at all. But in terms of DJs and producers in that sort of realm of music, there is a rave culture that basically says that you can't say no to the drugs, which in turn affects everything else, and it is the sex, drugs, rock and roll thing, again, in the electronic music industry. So it sort of crosses over all the time. Yeah, I think, one of my artists has come to me with a mental health problem before, and he's dealing with it at the moment, and that's fine, but he doesn't like to speak to his friends and family about it, so he'll come to me, and whilst I'm a great person to speak to about it, I have encouraged him to speak to other people because, as you say, it is really important to speak to everybody else about it. And I think that is one of the main things, is if you're really struggling with anything, you do need to speak to other people and try not to think about it making you look weak. And I think that's sort of what it comes down to.
Yeah. I think also there's a possible issue of confidentiality. I think managers are concerned that when they're sitting in between the artist and the label and dealing with the A&R on one hand and the artist on the other, that there's certain things they can't necessarily talk to the label about. We're about to do an event with Universal with a whole bunch of A&Rs and managers who manage acts signed to them to try and break down these barriers and these stigmas around mental health, because probably outside the artist, the three most vulnerable people are the manager, the A&R and the tour manager. So starting to break down some of these walls, I think, is really important, and ensuring that people are watching out for each other and can feel like they can have an open conversation if things aren't going quite the way they thought they would. We're also, just on a positive note, setting up training for managers, kind of like a mental health first aid course. In lots of big companies, you'll have a nominated first aid practitioner. They'll have gone and done their 1 day's first aid training.
Like occupational health.
Exactly, and it's necessary, and I think we need to have exactly the same thing for mental health. You need to know exactly how to react when someone comes and talks to you.
Well, that's exactly what I've got in front of me, is that I did a study as part of my final year research, and 64% of people said if there were provisions introduced to support individuals in the music industry, would you use any of the following? And the main one that people said was that they wanted help from management or from their label. And it's just something that just isn't done enough, and that's why that's really a great idea, is to introduce that, because that's what people want. So, and it's, I think it's really difficult at the moment. It's a really prevalent issue that really needs to be understood a lot more.
Yeah, well, we did a roundtable with managers last year, and one of the biggest issues that came up was that managers don't feel equipped to deal with things as they come up, especially on tour. If the artist has a panic attack or refuses to go on stage, they don't feel like they are qualified to deal with that. Because what you say to them in that moment is so vital, is so important. And making the right decision about whether they should be on stage or not is also a very important decision. If you've got 2,000 people waiting in the audience, is it right to put the artist out there? You have to be able to weigh up a situation and act on it in the best way.
Well, you said about tour managers, and that's the one thing that I've come across a lot, is that the tour managers are just as important as every other person that's on that team, because ultimately they're the ones that are going to be dealing with the highs and the lows whilst you are on tour. And as we were saying before over there, we were saying about how being on tour is so different to living a normal life, that everything's done for you whilst you're on tour, and then you get back into reality and it's completely different. And you said about people becoming like a shell of a person when they get back, and it's really difficult to come out of that and people will say to you, oh, well, it's fine, you're back now and you're just doing normal stuff. But that's much easier said than done when you've been touring the world for a year or 2 years, or even just Europe or whatever. You've been on a constant holiday and you've had everything done for you by a team of people that surround you, for that to be completely drawn away. And you were saying about something about the tour, everybody in the background becoming like a family and then being taken out of that. And that's just really difficult as well, because you are surrounded by those people for a period of time, and then you're completely separated from them. And just everything is contributing to the detriment of well-being as well.
I think that's quite a big problem as well, though, because without being critical, you did say the word holiday in there.
Well, yeah.
And that being associated with being on tour, and I think we talk to politicians quite a lot about this stuff. I think there's a huge perception that being on tour is a very, very glamorous, exciting and fun trip. Well, before I was at the MMF, I used to be a tour manager, and it's horrendous. It's
being
the
cooped
worst
up on a bus.
lifestyle
Yeah.
you could possibly want. Your airport, hotel, venue, hotel, airport, and that's all you see. You don't really see many of the places you go. I was chatting before, I saw Katie Melua do a little talk a couple of months ago, and we were talking about this stuff, and she'd completely forgotten that she played Wembley Arena. She had no idea, because it's all such a blur, and you're just pushed from pillar to post, and it can be hugely detrimental to your mental health and physical health. It's a very physical undertaking, being on tour for a long time.
Well, yeah, I mean, we were saying before about I've been in Europe, lots of different cities recently, and generally, maximum I'll get an hour to see that city, and that's like a push. Like, we went to Ghent in Belgium recently, and it's a lovely city, but I got 45 minutes to actually see it, because it is, as you say, airport, hotel, venue, back to the hotel, and then back off again somewhere else that you don't even know. So, yeah.
Everywhere becomes like the last, doesn't it? Just on the idea of the crew and the fellow band members kind of becoming family, and that all sounds nice and cosy, but as we all know, you put a bunch of people on tour, that doesn't matter in terms of their age or gender, they're cooped up on a tour bus or in a van or on a plane. Resentment festers, arguments happen, people get, drunk, people get off their heads on drugs, or people are just annoyed, and they start, something that starts as banter suddenly becomes bullying, and it's always the drummer that gets it. Always the drummer. Any drummers here? The drummers seem to always be the butt of every joke, or the punch bag in any kind of argument, and these people could have been mates since school, and it just takes one little comment or one little bad move, and then Jax is smiling
He gets it as well sometimes.
It's suddenly a harmonious family. It becomes like a divorce situation, or just a mega argument, and it can become physical, and it can become horrible, and it can go, it might just last 5 minutes, but it might go on for months and months and months and months and months. Life on the road has its glamorous bits, and it can be a lot of fun, But there are clearly a lot of downsides too. But again, it's about the job of a tour manager. I don't envy you. That must have been the hardest thing in the world. But tour managers need support as well in tackling people.
I mean, I'm routing a tour in Australia, and luckily it's only a couple of weeks. But even and I can't even imagine how you cope doing it for months and years on end.
I was really young. I had lots of energy. I'm now becoming a lawyer. That's how bad it was.
I think quite a few bands I can think of. They have their tour manager and the crew team, but they also have a minder or several minders just watching the situation. And one band that I work with, they brought in a former paratrooper to deal with all the arguments and deal with all, I mean, on the face of it, it was sort of like to deal with, over-enthusiastic fans, but actually it was really about trying to deal with the dynamics within the group. You needed a proper soldier in there to kind of literally break it up with army tactics and all of that. Not trying to put any of you off working in the music industry. There is you know, most of the time, the music industry is a lot of fun, but it is really, really crucially important that this area gets looked about and thought about and actioned, really, you know, because it has been neglected for so long. And, you know, you guys, when you go out into the industry, in a few months or in a year or in 2 years, you know, you will be stronger if you understand all these issues and if you're able to build it into your practice in dealing with artists or colleagues, you know, or indeed yourself, you know. And it's so brilliant that, you know, these organisations that, you know, the three of you represent, doing good work, raising awareness, doing training courses. Just want to go back to something that you said, Keiza, about artists feeling the need to keep producing work, keep the money coming in. Also the pressure maybe of trying to do a better record than last time, whether that better is judged on quality or on record sales. The flip side of that is bands that suddenly go, oh, I made this amazing record, everybody loved it, how am I going to do better than that? And you know, hitting a kind of creative block or hitting a kind of you know, basically inertia, you know. So you know, people, band managers, record labels need to think about how they deal with that. You know, there's a group that some of you may know called My Bloody Valentine, who made one of those universally critically acclaimed records in 1991. That got them a bigger record deal at another record label, and they then spent a year making the follow-up. But that year became 2, and 2 became 5, 5 became 10. You know, and they never did it. And you know, I don't know whether it was the pressure of the reputation or having a creative block. But that's another sort of issue to kind of deal with.
You're often not in the same physical or mental state after a really successful first album because everything changes.
Yeah.
And if you're living in a tiny little squatty flat when you wrote your first album and that contributed to your creative process, then suddenly maybe you're in like a penthouse in LA to write the next one.
Absolutely.
There's actually 2 people that come to mind when you say about that. I went to a talk with Dizzy Rascal after he was talking about, he made Boy in the Corner, got, as you say, a bit like My Bloody Valentine, got commissioned to do a second album by a much bigger label, and it completely flopped because, well, he sold out because you always want the next best thing. Is you get a little bit of money, but then you want more money, and then you want more money, and you keep pushing for that next step, and you never get to a point where you go, I'm happy, because you're always pushing to get, and then you get criticism because you sold out because you wanted more money. So then he got criticised heavily for becoming a commercial artist from being in the grime scene. And the other person is Sir Spyro, who makes all of his music, and he's now on One Extra regularly, makes all of his music literally in the basement of like an East London flat that is hired out, loads of different rooms, like box rooms, tiny little rooms, hired out by all these different producers that he just goes in with a key. There's no one living there or anything, nothing on the walls. I've been there before, and it's just stripped. It's just an empty building, like almost like an abandoned building that he makes everything in. And then you just think, after you've been on Radio 1, as you say, that will step up a bit, and then everything's going to change, and that change is going to be an imbalance for people, and that's when people are going to start struggling.
One of the things that people talked about quite a lot when they were being interviewed for the research was what does success mean? You know, is success about album sales? Is success about what do you define as success?
Yeah.
And I think if you're only talking about it in terms of how much money you make, then it may be that what you're producing is actually fantastic, but maybe you just don't get the break, or there's a lot of talk about the fact that a lot of it is it's down to luck, it's down to timing, it's down to circumstance, so it might be that what you're producing is fantastic, it doesn't get picked up. So does that mean that what you're producing was not good enough? There's that whole stuff about, well, what is success? And some of the people that were interviewed actually almost didn't want to use that word because it's so problematic in lots of different ways. Because if you're thinking about it from the outside, then success is about media interviews and coverage and album sales. But maybe that's not what success means to the person who's producing the music. Maybe it's about what they produce is success.
It's about
So where do you?
art
Yeah.
and
So where?
critically.
How do you define it?
And there's so much brilliant music that's never going to get heard by the outside world sometimes as well. I work with an artist who 9 out of 10 songs he makes never see the light of day. And they're all probably as brilliant as the rest of them. He's just not, something's just a little bit off with them or whatever. And to me, I get sent all of them. They're all fine in terms of release, but they'll never see the light of day because he's not totally happy with them. Yeah.
Perfectionism. I mean, just sort of going back to that My Bloody Valentine thing. I actually don't think with them I don't think that there was a mental health issue there, but there was this pressure and expectation that in some artists can lead to mental health issues. But just following the story of that act, to make another point, is that in that 10 or so years where they weren't making the follow-up, or the follow-up never coming out, myths grew, stories grew. The leader of the band, so the media said, had gone mad, and he had surrounded his house in Streatham with barbed wire and filled it with a load of chinchillas, right? And this allegedly was evidence of his madness. No, the guy just likes chinchillas, right? And Streatham back in the 90s was not the safest part of London. But what I'm trying to say is like, do you feel that the media and sometimes labels and sometimes even the artists themselves exploit or exaggerate ideas of mental health issues and madness to enhance their image or build their image? Again, I don't think this is the case with My Bloody Valentine, but I think the media built an image, but I don't think the artists did.
I don't think that was for purposes of exploitation, though. I think that was just them needing to find a story on something that was obviously something that was past, and no one ever heard anything about it. So it was like, something needs to come out. Let's just do this. Yeah. So I don't think it was them going.
Madness is a really good storyline. Mental health issues, really good storyline for the media. And I think that the media, sorry, music journalism students here, have some responsibility in terms of glamorising mental health issues, glamorising behaviour that leads to mental health issues, and accusing people of having mental health issues when they're dying, and it's quite difficult. I think it's dangerous, and I'm quite sure there's been occasions where labels and PR people have done it. I've never done it myself, I hasten to add, but I do think that sometimes, for the sake of image, people within the industry try and create a story around that, and surely that's not on.
That's why there is a a tendency to talk about mental health in a very simplistic way.
Yeah.
By the media, I mean, that it's, oh, if this, then that. And it's not really talked about in a compassionate kind of way.
Yeah.
It's not really talked about in a, this person is having a really difficult time. I mean, what you said about the Britney thing, it was almost, isn't this funny? It was almost a kind of, let's laugh at this. Yeah, exactly, it is. Rather than feeling compassion, because actually somebody's obviously in a very difficult position, is going through something that's distressing. And I think that there is an oversimplification, I think, sometimes, the way that mental health is talked about.
Well, the anime Stormzy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And when when people have taken their life, before anything comes out formally about what the cause of death was or anything, they'll often say, so-and-so have mental health issues. There's not even been a conclusion to anything, and they're already saying, well, this is what happens if you've got mental health issues, so this is what you do.
A lot of people go to the conclusion of suicide before anything else now, which is terribly sad, that before natural causes or anything else, people go, well, they must have killed themselves. And that's an awful conclusion to come to now.
But not just in music.
Yeah,
That's
everywhere.
Wow. Okay. So, what can we do about it? Obviously, training courses and the initiatives of health musicians. What other things can people in the industry now do? What can those students do in the future when they are in the industry?
I think one of the things is about what you were saying before, it's about education in a way. I think it's about, so often people have said, if only I had known, if only I had known that this was what it might be like. Because if you can say at the beginning, this is what you might experience, and here are some strategies for dealing with this, and here are some sources of support if you find that you're experiencing this. So I think a lot of it is around prevention in the first place, and education. If you can understand something, if you can recognise something, whether that's the people who work with them recognising what the signs of, when somebody's beginning to struggle, what that might look like, and what you can do about that, and where you can go. So I think that's something that can help. But it's very difficult in a way, to have such an enormous culture change, because it's partly the media, like you say. So how are you going to change? How are you going to make a change there so that people start talking about mental health in a different way? I think that is starting to happen because there's so much more awareness now, and people are talking about it more. So I think things are changing, but it's quite a shift from the way it's not that long ago that people were locked up in asylums, relatively. So we've come a long way, but there's a long way to go. And so I think part of that is much broader around society, but it is it's about how the media report things. It's about how people in the industry respond to things, and that is about their own awareness of the things. I don't know that there's a solution that you can say, here's the thing, if you do this, everything will be all right. I think it's got to come from sort of different angles, really, from inside the music industry, from outside the music industry. I think it's a cultural shift that's beginning to happen, I think.
It is purely down to information, I think. I mean, this was written a year and a half ago now, and there was a question that said, do you feel musicians get enough information on mental health within the industry? And we've got 77% said no. And then, the other side of it, 2.6% said they felt as though there was enough information in the music industry. And to have that out of thousands of responses, 2% of them is just not good enough at the moment, and I think that the training provided by MMF will be very useful in the future. I think that that's the best way of moving towards things, is to provide information, as you say, and go, this is how you can deal with this if this comes up. And I think that's, and just pushing that out to more people, and I think that universities are taking a good step in providing stuff like this so that people are aware of it, and perhaps they might look into it a bit more.
Yeah.
And that wasn't the case when I first wrote my research. It got put off for quite a long time because it wasn't being approved by an ethics board, because no one really knew. It was sort of one of those things that was sort of trodden around a bit because no one really knew whether it was ethically right to write about it. So it did get put off for quite a long time, but I think that universities are recognising it now, and I think that that's good for shaping the future of the new people that are going to be coming into the music industry as well. So yeah, that's what I stand on it.
Yeah, I totally agree with both of those points. I think generally in the world and in this country, mental health services, I think, are still pretty young. I think the understanding of mental health, even by doctors and professionals, is still very new. I know you mentioned Aristotle earlier, but in terms of our understanding of what's actually going on, it's really critical. And I think this industry should be a leader, a global leader, in providing the right kind of very specific support for the people that we work with.
Because at the end of the day, the money is there. So, you know, the money is being made despite all the doom-mongers. There's a lot of money sloshing around in the industry that could be devoted, you know, to provide more support services. You know, the labels who are often making loads and loads of money should be funding it. And you know, I don't know. I sort of look around a little bit and think. Often the initiatives are coming from musicians or former musicians or former industry people, but it should be coming from the industry organisations. You know, there's an organisation in Memphis in the States called Rock for Love, which set up by musicians to provide medical support to struggling musicians. You know, and mainly this is mental health issues and drug addictions. But it's come from the musicians themselves. It's not like, you know, the labels need to be held to account a little bit.
It's starting to happen.
It is starting to happen.
Sony
yeah.
did an event last week, specifically around mental health. They had about 300 people there. And a lot of it is about raising awareness, breaking down the stigma around it, because there is still so much embarrassment, amongst young A&R guys, you know, there is very much a lad culture within labels, and particularly agents. So there is this, you know, huge embarrassment that they can't mention it because it's seen as a weakness. So breaking all of that down it's starting to happen, and companies are starting to encourage that.
I wonder whether you know, anything can be learned from other industries, in terms of in football, certainly in elite football, when clubs are looking to sign young players or even established players, they're not just looking at how good they are at football. They are looking at their kind of personality and their mental strength, and they analyse their social media posts for signs of weaknesses and everything like that. Sounds kind of weird, but then they know what they're kind of getting into, and they know how they need to approach the artist. So, you know, that might be something that's useful. I've always found that from working in PR and a little bit in A&R, that when I take on a new client, or I'm thinking of taking on a new client, you know, I spend a lot of time getting to know them. You know, what's important to them, what inspires them, you know, what their motivations are, what their idea of success is, you know, whether they've got skeletons in their closet of whatever, you know, and all the time thinking, are they going to cope with the pressure? You know, what are they going to be like in the media? How are they going to find it? Are they, you know, have they got the mental strength to do it? And if they have, then I know I can press one button and if they haven't, then I know that I've got to treat them all with kid gloves and sort of limit the expectations a bit and build things slower. And I'm absolutely sure that some managers do this and some A&R people do it. But you know, again, it's about that responsibility that you have for the often young people that are in your care, you know, and try and, you know, understand how they are, give them the support they need, basically.
The only thing that's a little bit worrying about vetting people before you become a client or as such is the in football, if they find something, they'll often not sign them, and that will be the end. And that's not great, but that's just football. And I'm not sure that does happen in music. Definitely much more in commercial music than it does in any other sort of sub-genre or electronic music as such. But I mean, it doesn't really affect if I see a problem. It doesn't really. It flags it up, and as you say, it will make me move a different path. But the worry is that with that happening, is that there'll be amazing musicians that won't get signed because of it.
Yeah.
And
Could be
that's
discriminated against.
yes,
Yeah.
yes.
But I think that I can see the downside of that of that part of the football approach. I think it's important to know that, you know.
Yeah.
I think also within music, people are less likely to not sign artists because of perceived mental health issues. Because again, within the creative world, those sort of things are kind of either accepted or even glorified, as we sort of said before. But you know, some musicians, you know, when they see a review, you know that they are going to take it to heart, whether it's good or bad. Right? You know, good press can blow their ego up to unmanageable proportions, and bad press can absolutely destroy people. You know, they've invested all their emotions into a song, and someone slagged it off in the end. You know, and maybe it's only read by a few people, but you know, that can be an absolute moment of collapse. You know, I mean, I always say to people when I take them on, look, if you want to read the reviews or read the features, read them. Don't forget about them. Like, it's one person's opinion. It's only there. You know, it lasts for a day. It's gone. Right? If it's good, go fair enough. But don't rest on your laurels. And if it's bad, you know, again, you know, note the criticism, like the students have to when we give them feedback on assignments. Don't get down about it. Kind of learn from it, you know, and just move on. You know, move on. But it's easy to say it, and it's another thing to actually be the artist and deal with that kind of criticism.
Especially with creative minds as well. As a lot of music is very subjective as well, so it becomes quite difficult in terms of, as you say, it's sort of easier said than done to just forget about it on a day-to-day basis. But yeah, I mean, someone might love it. There's always going to be people that love and hate what you're doing, and you've just sort of got to get used to it. And it's about sort of surviving the music industry. I think that's the best way, which is unfortunate, but I'm hoping that with time it won't be about surviving anymore, and it'll be a good industry to really enjoy all of the time.
Yeah, that's a pretty good way to end. We could go on talking for ages. I'm going to throw it open to some questions from here, but before I do check out the Music Minds Matter campaign, because that's really important. So, any questions?
What's your opinion on YouTube musicians who have to deal with a lot of mental health? Like, there's Debbie Clark, who's known for dealing with mental health, and it's like put a lot in magazines, but it is glorified, but in the sense that she tries to glorify it in the sense of awareness so people don't feel like they're on their own, because it was, she's got deep personality disorder, which makes her kind of feel like drunk, and it's something that didn't have a lot of attention before, but stuff like that. Would you say there's any difference between musicians with sign than indie musicians that are usually based?
I think it's completely down to your preference, how you want to vocalise what it is that you're dealing with. You mentioned the Stormzy NME issue, where he talked about having depression but not on the record, and suddenly he was on the cover of NME as a poster boy for depression, and that wasn't, he was pretty pissed off about it, quite rightly, because that wasn't his choice to put it that way. I think it's brilliant when musicians feel they can talk up about it, and we're fortunate that we're in an industry where there are some really, really powerful voices who have a lot of impact and a lot of influence, and if that can be utilised the right way, I think we suffer from over speculation in the media a lot. That's not just specific to our industry, that's a ridiculous problem here and around the world. But if we can get authentic language coming from musicians and artists and the people around them about these issues, I think it can go a long way to help.
I think raising awareness is the best way of going about it, especially for something like that, because it's not the most common out of everything. So she is trying to really raise awareness for an issue that isn't as prevalent as depression and anxiety, which a lot of people suffer with. So yeah, I think that's great that she's trying to raise awareness of something that isn't as common. So yeah, having a voice.
Any other questions? Okay. Yes,
So as a manager, if you're working with multiple artists who some might have anxiety, some might have depression, at what point as a manager do you have to consider your own well-being over that? Because if you're working with 3 or 4 artists that are all very down, that could impact on you, and that could then re-impact on the artist and leave a bad situation.
For me, I mean, there's sort of a supervision element to it as well. So when you go for counselling, counsellors have supervision themselves as well. So because as you say, it has a detrimental effect. So I mean, I do speak to other people. I mean, I'm personally not suffering with anything at the moment. I do have 4 or 5 different people suffering with various different things at the moment. And I do speak to them on a daily, every other day basis. And luckily it doesn't affect me so much, but I completely see what you're saying in terms of, I do know a few managers that do go and speak to other people, especially other managers, to just sort of level them out a little bit and to make it all right as a supervision sort of element of things. And I mean, I come from a counselling background as well, in terms of my family are all counsellors. So luckily for me, I have that sort of background where I can go and speak to other people. But yeah, I would imagine that it does become quite detrimental, and I think that's where the MMF training comes in, to learn how to deal with it a bit more.
I think in terms of the importance of it, it's absolutely paramount. I think your own mental health, your own well-being comes before anyone else's, and you have to look after that. Yes, it is difficult dealing with people who have mental illness. I've got quite a bit of mental illness in my own family. I come from a family of musicians. And we have schizophrenia and OCD and all kinds of things that happen. And it can really, really take its toll. You asked the question earlier about what we can learn from other industries, and I was going to mention the supervisory thing. It's so important to have, because therapists sit there all day, take on everyone else's problems. And as a manager, one of the roles you have is kind of like a therapist. That's one of the things you do. So it's really important that you're able to go and offload onto somebody else who, they can be within the industry, in which case they'll probably understand it a bit more, or it could be someone outside of it who might be able to spot different patterns and things going on that might end up having quite negative things happen. So yeah, I'd say it's really, really important, definitely.
Just, talking about mental health and, dealing with it and things, and, taking drugs, alcohol, the negative effect that can have on your headspace. I was just wondering if, in your field and dealing with it, whether diet and exercise factors into any of that as well, or how that might affect your headspace as well. Because I know personally, from my younger days to now, changing the way I live and what I eat has helped a lot. And I just wonder whether that's a factor that's considered quite an important one or not. I don't really know in that really.
Yeah, absolutely.
Massively, massively important.
I think in the guide every bit of advice about, because we talk a lot about anxiety, depression, alcohol and addiction, but also issues very specific to managers such as stress management, codependency, and a lot of that, you have to eat healthily, you have to get enough sleep.
Yeah.
You have to
All impossible to
take
do
some
as
extra.
well.
Yeah, I was about to say, yeah.
You have to make time for it, and you have to push yourself to live a healthy. It's an effort to do a lot of the time.
Yeah.
You definitely have to do it for sure.
I came across someone recently that's hired as a nutritionist for the tour,
Yeah.
because it is so important to keep on top of what you're eating. And I find especially as when I go off for a weekend in Europe, I eat absolute crap, because you're just you stop in service stations and you can't count what you're eating at service stations, and you just end up eating crap all weekend and then feeling crap for the rest of the week.
And there is a link particularly as well, it is known that exercise can actually help move,
Serotonin.
so, and one of the things, that came out in the study was how few people were actually taking regular exercise. It was a small number of people who were. And that's another thing, poor nutrition, a lack of exercise is not going to help you in terms of your well-being, definitely.
I'll tell you one good thing, Johnny Marr from the Smiths, he takes his group out for a run while they're on tour every day, because he knows that it's going to be beneficial. They're hearing for everyone else.
There's a great tour manager, Andy Ingold. I was chatting to him, and he specifically books the tour around, if you're fortunate enough to be able to do that, sometimes it takes a bit of extra budget. But yeah, he'll book the tour around ensuring that the bands are getting out there, doing various things, trying, going up a mountain one day, and just making sure that their tour is rooted around those sorts of activities, which I think is really important. Go and get some food on tour. Trying to find some decent food. It's just horrendous. Yeah.
I think a lot can go into the planning. To plan a tour around areas of interest or activities is a great idea. But also, if you, there's a range of tour t-shirts at the moment, designed by a guy called Scott King, who's a graphic designer, and it's based on the insane tour schedules of bands in the late 60s and the 70s, like Led Zeppelin, and you just see lines crisscrossing the country like that. It doesn't take a genius to work out that if you start your tour in London, your next stop should probably be Brighton or Southampton and not Edinburgh. But in the past, people were doing crazy tours, and and you need to build in time between shows. You can't do 14 gigs in 14 days. You just can't. It's going to take its toll. You can't go from Japan straight to America and do another tour. But yeah, I think better planning, better.
That's still around, the unplannedness. I mean, we've got one this weekend that's Newcastle to Brighton. It's just a horrendous journey, but still happens all the time, unfortunately. And I wish people, like tour route people that are tour managers, would just go, okay, well, let's work out how we're going to do it all the way up. Maybe just switch a little bit rather than going up, down, which does happen in Britain particularly a lot because it's small. But then you realise that Newcastle to Brighton is 7.5 hours on a train, let alone if you're going to be on a tour bus and you're going to want to make stops for half an hour at a time and stretch your legs, and that literally becomes like wake up in the morning, get on the bus, go all the way to Brighton, get off and not have any time to rest in between and go straight to your next show, and then just, yeah, it takes its toll, for sure.
Any more questions? So hopefully you're all enlightened by all of this, and we'll keep thinking about these issues when you go into the industry. And hopefully you're happy to hang around for a little bit if people want to come chat. Great stuff. So if we can all thank the panel.